Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Haunted Carriage, Chapter 1, The Impossible Crime. It was on a dreary evening in late October, as the rain lashed against the window panes of our Baker Street lodgings, that I first learned of the singular case that would soon occupy all of Sherlock Holmes's formidable faculties. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting flickering shadows upon Holmes's sharp features as he sat, pipe in hand, absorbed in his own silent contemplations. I had been immersed in the medical journals of the day, but I confess my mind was only half on the articles before me. I had learned long ago that any prolonged silence on Holmes's part usually presaged a case of some extraordinary nature, and tonight his brow was more furrowed than usual, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that familiar pose of reflection. The knock at the door came sharp and sudden, breaking the quiet of our room. Mrs. Hudson, ever the vigilant sentinel of our domain, ushered in none other than Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his coat dripping from the rain, his expression a curious mixture of consternation and excitement. "Ah, Lestrade," Holmes said without moving from his chair. "I trust the matter that brings you out on such an inclement night is one of some urgency?" "You might say that, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade replied, rubbing his gloved hands together and glancing anxiously about. "It's a matter unlike any I've encountered in my years on the force. A murder, or what we must assume to be murder. And yet—" He hesitated, as though unsure how to proceed. Holmes gestured to the chair opposite him. "Pray, compose yourself, Inspector. A matter that brings you to my door on a night like this cannot be ordinary." Lestrade sat heavily, leaning forward. "Have you ever heard of Sir Archibald Greaves of Netherfield House?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "A baronet of some repute, I believe, owner of a sizable estate near Richmond, a financier and collector of antiquities. But what of him?" "He was found dead this morning, Mr. Holmes. But how he died is what baffles us all. And to add to it, there are rumours." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Rumours?" Lestrade glanced over his shoulder, as if to make certain we were alone. "They say he was killed by a ghostly carriage, a black coach drawn by phantom horses, seen by multiple witnesses, passing through the locked gates of his estate and vanishing into thin air." I admit I could not help but let out a soft laugh. "Surely, Lestrade, you don't mean to say you give any credence to such superstitions?" The inspector gave me a sharp look. "Dr. Watson, you know me well enough to understand I place no stock in such tales, but facts are facts. The gardener saw it from the grounds, the housekeeper from her window. And when Sir Archibald's body was discovered, in his study, the door locked from the inside, and no sign of entry or exit. The only marks about him were strange wheel tracks and hoof prints imprinted inside the room itself." Holmes's fingers steepled more tightly, his gaze now fixed intently on Lestrade. "Wheel tracks and hoof prints indoors?" Holmes repeated softly. "Exactly. And there's more. Sir Archibald was terrified of that carriage, Mr. Holmes. It's an old legend in the family, the black coach of Netherfield. They say it comes for every male heir who dares to cross a certain line, though what line that is, no one seems to know. Superstition often conceals the more mundane workings of greed and malice." Holmes murmured. "Tell me, what was Sir Archibald doing prior to his death? Was there a gathering, or had he made any enemies?" Lestrade shook his head. The night before, he had dined alone. His niece and heir, Miss Evelyn Greaves, had been away visiting friends. Servants report nothing unusual, save for his own growing dread these past few weeks. He had spoken often of hearing carriage wheels at night, though nothing could ever be found. "And the study, you say it was locked?" Holmes asked sharply. "Yes, locked and bolted from the inside. The only key was on Sir Archibald's person. Windows shut, no secret passages. We checked thoroughly." Holmes rose abruptly, walking to the window where the rain ran in rivulets down the glass. He stood silent for a moment, pipe smoke curling about him like a spectre of thought. "An impossible crime, Watson," he said at last. "A man killed by a carriage that could not be there, in a room no one could have entered, and witnesses to a phantom vehicle. Fascinating." He turned suddenly, his eyes alight. "Lestrade, we shall take this case. Watson, pack your bag. We leave for Netherfield House at first light." And with that, Holmes strode to his desk, pulling maps and timetables from his files, while I sat watching him, that familiar thrill stirring in my chest. For I knew that once more I would be drawn into one of Holmes's singular adventures, where reason would be pitted against the seemingly impossible, and where only his razor-sharp intellect could hope to cut through the web of mystery. What secret lay behind the legend of the haunted carriage? And who, or what, had killed Sir Archibald Greaves? Of these questions, only time and Holmes would reveal the answers. Chapter 2. The Mysterious Visitor. The morning was heavy with fog, its grey fingers curling against the window panes of Baker Street. I had just returned from my rounds, and found Holmes sitting silently in his armchair, lost in thought. The fire was burning low, casting faint shadows that danced across the walls, and the ever-present haze of tobacco smoke hung in the air, swirling gently above Holmes's head. Without so much as a glance in my direction, Holmes spoke. "You seem unusually burdened, my dear Watson. A difficult morning, or has the weather chilled your spirits?" I smiled faintly as I removed my gloves and coat. "Both, I suppose. But how did you know?" Holmes tapped his long fingers together, an amused glint in his eye. "The mud splattered on the edge of your left trouser leg suggests you cut across Hyde Park, as you often do to avoid the crowded streets. The way you pressed your temple as you entered tells me you've a lingering headache, perhaps brought on by the dampness and the fog." I could not help but chuckle. "Nothing escapes you, Holmes. I dare say you have had a more interesting morning than I." Holmes smiled, but instead of answering, he reached for a telegram resting on the table beside him. "Until now, perhaps. This arrived a short time ago, an invitation, or rather a plea, for assistance." He handed me the slip of paper, and I read it aloud. "Mr. Holmes, I beg for your urgent help in a matter of life and death. Please grant me an audience today. Evelyn Marchmont." Holmes leaned back, watching me. "Miss Marchmont will be here shortly, and if her message is any indication, Watson, we may soon be engaged in a case that reaches beyond the ordinary." "A woman in distress," I mused. "Perhaps some matter of domestic trouble?" "Perhaps," Holmes agreed, "but something in her wording, life and death, suggests more than a lover's quarrel or a matter of inheritance." At that very moment, A sharp knock sounded at the door. Holmes merely nodded toward it. "That, I believe, is Miss Marchmont." Mrs. Hudson appeared, looking a bit pale herself, and ushered in a woman cloaked in a long dark coat, a veil obscuring her face. As she entered, she hesitated, as though uncertain whether to proceed. Holmes rose and gestured to the chair opposite. "Miss Marchmont, please do sit. You are among friends." She removed her veil, revealing a face pale but refined, with dark eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I come to you in desperation." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Please, tell us what troubles you." She took a deep breath. "It is my uncle, Lord Ashcombe. For weeks now something has haunted him, something that haunts us all. A carriage, Mr. Holmes, a phantom carriage drawn by ghostly horses, has been seen more than once on the grounds of Ashcombe Manor." Holmes raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, inviting her to continue. "My uncle first saw it himself, late at night, on the old path that leads into the woods. Since then, the servants have seen it too, and now none dare venture near the woods after dark." I leaned forward, sceptical but intrigued. "A ghostly carriage? Forgive me, Miss Marchmont, but surely such things are the stuff of folklore." She turned to me, her expression grave. "Doctor, I would agree with you if not for the terrible events that have followed. The first time it appeared, a maid was found dead the next morning, her face frozen in terror. And now my uncle lies bedridden, fevered and muttering about the carriage returning." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Interesting. And what do you believe?" She hesitated. "I do not know what to believe, Mr. Holmes, but I fear for my uncle's life, and I fear that if something is not done, worse will follow." Holmes stood and walked to the window, staring out into the mist. "Miss Marchmont, has anyone outside the household seen this apparition?" She shook her head. "No, only those within. And yet the manor is abuzz with fear. Servants have begun to leave, and still the carriage comes." Holmes turned back to her. "Is there any history attached to this tale? Any legend of such a carriage?" Nodded slowly. "There are old stories spoken of in hushed voices. They say that many years ago a great tragedy befell our family. A violent feud and a runaway carriage that ended in death. But no one speaks of it now. Until recently, it was merely a shadow of the past." Holmes tapped his chin thoughtfully. "A legend revived, now causing very real fear and death. You are right to seek a rational explanation." Miss Marchmont glanced at me with a faint smile. "Watson, I think the fog of London will soon give way to the shadows of Ashcombe Manor." I smiled back, already sensing the adventure that lay ahead. "Miss Marchmont," Holmes said, turning once more to our visitor, "we shall leave for Ashcombe Manor at first light. Rest assured, we will do all we can to uncover the truth behind these sinister occurrences." Relief flooded her features as she rose, thanking Holmes and me both. After she had gone, Holmes remained by the window, watching the fog curl against the glass. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked at last. He turned to me, a gleam in his eye. "My dear Watson, there is always a reason behind every ghost story. The question is whether that reason walks on two legs, and what it hopes to gain." He reached for his violin, the first notes filling the room as I sat back, wondering what dark secrets Ashcombe Manor might hold. Chapter 3. Journey into the Fog. The following morning dawned pale and colourless, the sky a blanket of grey, as if the clouds themselves were reluctant to move. By the time we left Baker Street, the fog had thickened, rolling over the streets of London in dense waves. Holmes, as ever, seemed unaffected by the gloomy weather, his eyes sharp and thoughtful as he settled into the corner of the railway carriage. As the train began its steady journey into the countryside, I sat opposite Holmes, watching him as he stared out of the window, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on the rails filled the silence between us, but I could see that Holmes's mind was already deep within the walls of Ashcombe Manor. At last I broke the silence. "You think there is a human hand behind this apparition, Holmes?" He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "My dear Watson, I think there is always a human hand somewhere, either in the creation of the illusion or in the reaction to it. Whether that hand belongs to an enemy, a friend, or a frightened mind, that is what we must discover." I leaned back, watching the mist-shrouded fields slip past the window. "And the deaths, Holmes? Surely they cannot be explained by mere fright." Holmes nodded slowly. "Exactly, Watson. The presence of death, particularly sudden death, complicates matters. It may be that fear alone claimed the life of the poor maid, but it is also possible that someone used fear as a mask for murder." The train continued its journey, the grey countryside rolling by in soft blurred outlines. As we drew nearer to our destination, I could not help but feel a growing sense of unease, as though the fog itself carried whispers of the ghostly carriage we were soon to confront. When at last we arrived at the small station nearest to Ashcombe Manor, a lone carriage awaited us, this one very much of this world, though its dark colour and worn appearance gave it an eerie look amidst the fog. A thin, wiry man stood beside the carriage, his hat pulled low and a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. He approached us as we stepped onto the platform. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I've been sent to fetch you to Ashcombe Manor. Miss Marchmont said you'd be expected." Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you. And you are?" "Name's Collins, sir. I've worked the grounds for nigh on 20 years. Never seen the place like this, though. Folks are saying things best left unsaid." Holmes watched him carefully as we climbed into the carriage. "What things, Mr. Collins? Speak freely." Collins hesitated, glancing around as if to be sure no one was listening. "They say the Ashcombe ghost has returned, sir. The black carriage that rides at night, drawn by headless horses. And now, with the master of the house laid up sick, and that poor maid gone, well, people are saying it's a curse." Holmes's expression did not change, but I could see a flicker of interest in his eyes. "And what do you think, Mr. Collins?" Collins looked at Holmes directly, his eyes sharp, beneath the brim of his hat. "I think there's always someone behind a curse, sir. Curses don't drive carriages." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Well said, Mr. Collins. I believe we shall get along." The carriage began to move, wheels creaking as we set off through narrow lanes bordered by bare trees. The fog swirled between the trunks, giving the impression of shadowy figures watching from the woods. As we neared Ashcombe Manor, the great house loomed ahead, its dark stone walls rising out of the mist like the shape of a forgotten castle. Tall windows stared blankly at us, and the great iron gates swung open with a mournful groan as Collins guided the carriage through. The manor itself was a grand structure, though age and neglect had begun to take their toll. Vines crept up its sides and patches of stonework showed signs of wear. Yet there was still something imposing about its silhouette against the pale sky. We were met at the entrance by Miss Marchmont, her face pale but resolute. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so swiftly." Holmes stepped down and gave her a slight bow. "Miss Marchmont, I trust your uncle remains stable." She shook her head sadly. "No change. He speaks of the carriage, even in his fever dreams." Holmes turned to me briefly before addressing her again. "Then may we see him at once? The sooner we understand his condition, the better. Of course, this way, please." As we followed her inside, I was struck by the gloom that seemed to fill the house. Though a fire burned weakly in the main hall, it did little to dispel the heavy shadows that clung to the corners of the room. Miss Marchmont led us up the grand staircase, and along a corridor where portraits of stern ancestors glared down to date us. She paused before a heavy oak door and turned to us. "My uncle is inside. Please, if there is anything you can do to help him, Mr. Holmes, I beg you to do so." Holmes placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You have my word, Miss Marchmont." With that, she pushed open the door, and we stepped into the darkened chamber beyond. The figure that lay in the bed was a shadow of a man, pale, gaunt, and restless, his hands clutching the sheets as though warding off some unseen terror. His eyes, half open, stared at the ceiling as he murmured words we could barely hear. Holmes approached the bedside quietly, observing every detail. The flicker of the man's eyes, the deep lines etched into his face, the strange tension in his limbs. As Holmes leaned closer, we both heard the faintest whisper escape the sick man's lips. "It's coming! The carriage! The black horses!" Holmes straightened and turned to me, his face unreadable. "Watson, I think we must watch for ourselves tonight." I nodded grimly, knowing that before long we too might witness the terrifying vision that haunted the grounds of Ashcombe Manor. Chapter 4. The First Night Watch. The day slipped away into dusk, and by the time Holmes and I had finished our supper in the shadowed dining hall, the fog had pressed close to the windows, turning the glass panes into pale, glowing sheets. Miss Marchmont joined us briefly, her eyes weary from tending her uncle, though she tried to maintain her composure. Holmes asked her careful questions about the events leading up to her uncle's collapse. "There had been rumours, Mr. Holmes," she said softly, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she seemed to have forgotten. "People in the village whisper about the Ashcombe ghost, how every few years the black carriage appears, and soon after tragedy follows. And you?" Holmes asked gently. "What do you believe, Miss Marchmont?" She looked away toward the window, her voice faltering for a moment. "I don't know what to believe. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but when you hear the horses at night, when you see that thing in the mist—" She broke off, trembling. Holmes leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. "And when did you first see it?" She hesitated. 3 nights ago. I was in my room when I heard the sound. Wheels grinding on the gravel, horses' hooves pounding as though they were made of iron. I thought perhaps someone had come to visit, though it was late. But when I looked from my window, her voice dropped to a whisper. There it was, a black carriage with lanterns that burned blue like cold fire, and inside I saw nothing but shadow. Then it was gone. Holmes gave a small nod, as though confirming something to himself. And since then your uncle took ill? Yes, that same night. He woke screaming, saying it had come for him. Holmes rose, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Miss Marchmont. You have been most helpful. I believe Watson and I will take a walk around the grounds before retiring. She looked up sharply. Be careful. If the stories are true. Holmes gave her a thin smile. Rest assured, Miss Marchmont, I have yet to meet a ghost that did not leave footprints. With that, we left her and stepped out into the night. The fog was thicker than ever, coiling around the trees like pale smoke. We made our way down a narrow path that led from the house to the wide open drive where the carriage was said to appear. Holmes moved with careful precision, his eyes scanning the ground as we walked. You do not think it supernatural, then? I asked quietly, my voice sounding muffled in the heavy mist. Holmes gave a soft chuckle. My dear Watson, if ghosts truly existed, Scotland Yard would be far busier than it already is. No, there is a hand behind this. Flesh and blood I am, sure. We reached the main drive, the stones damp and gleaming in the moonlight that struggled to break through the fog. Holmes knelt, examining the ground closely with his magnifying glass. Look here, Watson, he said, pointing to a faint impression. A wheel mark, recent, and here, hoof prints, though not of ordinary horses. See how deep they are, how sharp, as though shod with something heavy, perhaps weighted. I peered at the marks, barely visible even in the silver wash of moonlight. Could someone have used them to create the illusion? I asked. Holmes smiled slightly. That is what we are here to find out. For an hour or more, we walked the grounds in silence, observing every detail, every shadow that moved in the swirling mist. The night was still, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of wind through the bare branches. But as midnight drew near, something changed. From somewhere beyond the far end of the drive, where the mist lay thickest, came a sound that made my blood run cold, the distant creak of wheels turning slowly, followed by the sharp strike of hooves on stone. Holmes stiffened beside me, his eyes narrowing. There it is, Watson, he murmured, right on time. We stood still, straining our eyes into the fog. Slowly, like a vision from a nightmare, it began to appear. A carriage, black as pitch, its surface gleaming dully in the pale light, rolled forward out of the mist. Its wheels moved almost silently now, but the horses that pulled it, great dark beasts, snorted and pawed the ground, their eyes glowing eerily. I felt a chill run through me as I saw them more clearly. There's something wrong with them, Holmes, I whispered. Their heads, Holmes was already watching intently. Yes, Watson. Either the fog plays tricks on us, or someone has gone to great lengths to create a monstrous sight. The carriage rolled past us, seeming to glide over the stones rather than ride upon them. No driver sat atop it, and behind its curtained windows only darkness stared back. Holmes turned to me, his voice low but firm. Come, Watson, We follow. And so, with the fog swirling around us and the cold night air pressing in, we set off after the ghostly carriage, determined to uncover the truth behind Ashcombe Manor's darkest mystery. Chapter 5. The Chase Through the Fog. We moved, swiftly yet silently, keeping to the shadows of the great yew trees that lined the drive. The black carriage rolled on ahead of us, its wheels making barely a sound, as though it floated rather than travelled over the stone. The horses' breath steamed in the night air, but still there was something unnatural about their gait. Too smooth, too measured. Holmes crouched low as we reached a curve in the drive where the fog thickened. He raised his hand for me to stop, and we watched as the carriage slowed, almost as if aware that it was being followed. "Observe, Watson," Holmes whispered, eyes sharp with calculation. "No driver, and yet it moves with purpose, controlled. But how?" Before I could answer, a faint glimmer of light caught Holmes's eye. He pointed toward the base of the hedge running along the path. "Look there. See that faint wire, nearly invisible in the mist? A guide, perhaps. Mechanical, Watson, not supernatural." I peered closer, and indeed could just make out a thin, taut wire running along the stones, vanishing into the fog ahead. "Oh, a clever contraption," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to me. "But why? And to what end?" As we pressed forward, keeping careful pace with the ghostly carriage, Holmes stopped suddenly and knelt by the path. He pointed to something small and glinting caught between two stones. "A fragment of metal, Watson. Brass, likely from a mechanism controlling the wheels. Someone has spared no expense in crafting this illusion." "But to frighten Sir Ashcombe?" I asked. "Or Miss Marchmont?" "Possibly both," Holmes replied, rising to his feet. "The question is, who stands to gain from such terror? And more importantly, what are they hiding under the cover of these theatrics?" Just then, a sharp sound cut through the night. The yew carriage had reached the far end of the drive, and was now turning toward the cliff's edge, where the grounds ended abruptly above the sea. Holmes quickened his pace. "Come, Watson. If we are to catch the puppeteer behind this, we must be swift." We moved fast, dodging between hedgerows and keeping low to avoid being seen, though who or what might see us in that murk was hard to say. As we neared the cliffside, the fog began to thin, and moonlight illuminated the scene before us. The black carriage came to a sudden halt. Its horses pawed the ground, mist rising from their flanks like smoke. Still, there was no driver. Holmes motioned for silence and gestured for me to move to the left while he went right, intending to approach the carriage from both sides. My heart pounded as I crept forward, my eyes darting between Holmes and the motionless carriage. Then, just as Holmes neared the rear wheel, something unexpected happened. From the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged, cloaked in black, their face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. They moved swiftly to the carriage, adjusting something beneath its undercarriage. Holmes, quick as a flash, surged forward and caught the figure by the arm. "I think you'll stay with us a moment longer," he said sharply. The figure struggled, but Holmes's grip was firm. I rushed forward to assist, and together we turned the man or woman, for in the dark it was hard to tell, toward the moonlight. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded. The figure said nothing, but as Holmes pulled the cloak away, I recognised the pale, drawn face of Mr. Alistair, Sir Ashcombe's long-time steward. "You!" I exclaimed. Holmes looked at me briefly, nodding. "Yes, Watson, the man who has served Sir Ashcombe for over 20 years, and yet perhaps not as loyally as believed." Alistair glared at Holmes but said nothing. Holmes, unbothered by the silence, crouched to examine the mechanism under the carriage. "Weighted horseshoes, I see," he said aloud as he examined them, "and wheels fitted to run smoothly along that wire path. A marvel of engineering, but all designed to inspire terror, not transport." Holmes straightened and turned to Alistair. "And now, sir, you will tell us why you have gone to such extraordinary lengths to torment your master. What is it you seek to gain by driving Sir Ashcombe into madness, or worse?" Still, Alistair said nothing. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Very well. If you will not speak, perhaps a conversation with Sir Ashcombe or the constable will loosen your tongue." Alistair's jaw tightened, but Holmes merely gestured for us to return to the house. As we began to lead him away, Holmes leaned close to me and whispered, "There is still more to uncover here, Watson. Much more. And I suspect we are only at the beginning of the true mystery behind Ashcombe Manor, Chartres." The fog swirled around us once more as we made our way back, the black carriage standing empty behind us, its secrets beginning to unravel. Chapter 6. A contradiction in Shadow's morning arrived with little cheer. The grey skies hung low over Ashcombe Manor, and a thin drizzle streaked the window panes as Watson and I sat once more in the study. Sir Ashcombe, pale and agitated, paced the room, while Miss Marchmont sat stiffly in a chair, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. Across from them, Mr. Alistair, now stripped of his dark cloak, but maintaining a cold silence, glared sullenly at the hearth as if it might offer him some defence against Holmes's piercing gaze. "You realise, of course," Holmes began quietly, "that there are details in this case which do not fit together, details that render any easy conclusion impossible." Sir Ashcombe turned sharply. "Not fit together, Mr. Holmes. Surely you saw the same as I, Alistair behind that devil's carriage. Is that not proof enough?" Holmes steepled his fingers, eyes half-lidded in thought. Proof of his hand in the deception, perhaps. But as to why, there lies the true puzzle, and there are contradictions that refuse to be ignored. Miss Marchmont looked up, her voice low but steady. "What contradictions, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the window, watching the rain. "Consider, Watson," he said, turning to me, "the sequence of events. The appearance of the phantom carriage always preceded by a faint bell chime, heard by Sir Ashcombe, Missy Marchmont, and even yourself." I nodded. "Yes, Holmes, as though to summon or herald its coming." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And yet last night, when we followed the carriage and discovered Alistair adjusting the mechanism, there was no bell." Sir Ashcombe stopped pacing. "No bell?" he asked, confused. Holmes turned, his eyes sharp. "None, Sir Ashcombe. I listened for it. And what does that suggest?" Watson frowned. "That someone else, someone not Alistair, was responsible for the bell sound? An accomplice?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps, or perhaps even something more sinister. Consider further. Mr. Alistair's guilt is clear in the creation of the carriage, But is he the only architect of this charade? His silence suggests more than mere fear of disgrace. Holmes turned back to Alistair, who now looked less defiant and more troubled. "What of the locked library, Alistair?" Holmes asked suddenly. "Why did you not mention its use in the carriage's construction? You held the key for Sir Ashcombe all these years, and yet you said nothing of it until now." Alistair shifted in his seat but said nothing. Holmes continued, his voice low and deliberate. "There is more you know, more you fear to tell. Because if this deception has gone on longer than we imagine, there is someone you protect." Sir Ashcombe stared at Alistair, bewildered. Protect? Alistair, what does he mean? Still, the steward said nothing, but his eyes betrayed him. A flicker of fear, of indecision. Holmes paced slowly. "And now to another matter," he murmured, "the curious incident of the will." Miss Marchmont stirred. "The will?" "Indeed," Holmes said, pausing to face her. "Sir Ashcombe's revised testament, which he mentioned having sent to his solicitor, but which, oddly, has never arrived. You, Miss Marchmont, stood to inherit half the estate in that version, did you not?" Her cheeks flushed slightly, but she met Holmes's gaze evenly. "Yes, I did, but what of it? I had no hand in its disappearance, Mr. Holmes." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps not. And yet I cannot help but notice that the phantom carriage began its appearances shortly after the new will was written. That coincidence? Or is it pressure upon Sir Ashcombe to revert to the old will, I wonder?" Sir Ashcombe's hands trembled. "Holmes, you think someone is trying to drive me to madness, to force my hand?" Holmes glanced at him, his face unreadable. "It is a possibility we must consider. For if not madness, then terror, and terror can be a weapon wielded for gain." Just then a sharp knock at the study door interrupted us. Lestrade, damp from rain, entered with a grim expression. "Beg pardon, sir," he said, glancing uneasily at Holmes, "but we've just found something at the edge of the cliffs. A torn piece of parchment. Looks like it may have been tossed there to be rid of." He handed Holmes a damp but legible fragment of paper. Holmes read it swiftly, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. Watson leaned in, catching only the words, "By order of the master, under strict secrecy, midnight." Holmes handed it to me without comment, and I read it fully. It was a fragment of a note, clearly written by Alistair, referencing secret instructions tied to the phantom carriage. But the way it was phrased, "by order of the master," suggested he had been commanded to act, not acting alone. Holmes's eyes glinted with sharp intensity as he turned to Alistair. "So, sir," Holmes said softly, "you acted on orders, but whose? That, I think, is the question that will unravel this entire web." Alistair swallowed, but still held his silence. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Very well. If you will not speak, then we must follow other trails. But mark my words, this house holds deeper secrets, and soon they will not remain in shadow." With that, Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, keep a close watch on Mr. Alistair. And Watson, I think it is time we visited the Ashcombe vaults." "The vaults, Holmes?" I asked, startled. Holmes gave me a brief, enigmatic look. "Yes, Watson. For if the answer is not among the living, perhaps it lies with the dead." Chapter 7. into the vaults of Ashcombe. The rain had grown heavier as we made our way toward the family vaults that lay beyond the old chapel, down a narrow path flanked by twisted trees. Holmes walked ahead with determined steps, his lantern casting long shadows that swayed and danced along the mossy stone walls. I followed close behind, my coat drawn tightly against the wind. Behind us, Inspector Lestrade and Sir Ashcombe came more hesitantly, the baronet pale and gaunt, as if dreading what we might uncover. "Holmes," I called softly over the sound of the wind, "what is it you expect to find down here?" Holmes glanced at me, his face unreadable in the flickering light. "Answers, Watson, or at least evidence to confirm a theory that has begun to take shape." As we reached the heavy iron door of the vault, Sir Ashcombe fumbled with a large key, his hands trembling. "I have not been down here in years," he murmured, since her death." The door groaned on rusted hinges as it opened, revealing a narrow stairway that led deep underground. The air that met us was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and stone. We descended in silence, our footsteps echoing in the confined space, until we reached a wide chamber lined with stone sarcophagi. Dust lay thick upon them, and in the lantern's light the carved names of the Ashcombe ancestors stood out faintly. Holmes swept the light around until it fell upon a newer tomb, Lady Eleanor Ashcombe's final resting place. Sir Ashcombe stepped forward, his voice breaking. "My dear wife." Holmes remained still for a long moment, then moved toward a far wall where a smaller, unmarked door stood. It was secured with a modern lock, one that seemed oddly out of place in such an ancient room. "Curious," Holmes murmured, kneeling to examine it. "Tell me, Sir Ashcombe, are you aware of this door?" The baronet looked confused. "No, I've never seen it before." Holmes straightened, glancing at Lestrade. "Inspector, would you?" With a nod, Lestrade stepped forward, and using a set of tools from his pocket, worked at the lock until it clicked open. Holmes pushed the door inward, and we were greeted by a dark passage leading further underground. We exchanged glances but said nothing as Holmes led the way. The corridor was narrow, carved from stone, and led to a small chamber where strange equipment was stacked. Gears, pulleys, lengths of heavy rope, and what looked to be sections of broken lanterns and wheels, all coated in dust, but clearly related to the ghostly carriage. Holmes knelt to examine them. As I suspected, the mechanism for the phantom carriage, parts discarded when no longer needed. Lestrade stepped forward, frowning. "So this is where he hid the pieces. Alistair?" Holmes shook his head, eyes sharp. "Perhaps, but look here." Here, Joe pointed to a leather-bound ledger resting on a stone shelf. "Records of expenses. Payments made to someone under initials that do not match Alistair's." He flipped through the pages as we gathered around. "Look, this entry. To R.M. for continued. Silence. Final payment. Who is R.M.? Holmes mused aloud. Sir Ashcombe looked utterly bewildered. "I don't know of anyone with those initials. At least no one connected to this house." Holmes closed the ledger thoughtfully. "Someone is orchestrating this from the shadows. Someone with knowledge of your family's secrets, and resources enough to threaten and pay off others. He turned to Sir Ashcombe suddenly. Holmes gave me a brief, enigmatic look. Yes, Watson, for if the answer is not among the living, perhaps it lies with the dead. Chapter 7. Into the Vaults of Ashcombe. The rain had grown heavier as we made our way toward the family vaults that lay beyond the old chapel, down a narrow path flanked by twisted trees. Holmes walked ahead with determined steps, his lantern casting long shadows that swayed and danced along the mossy stone walls. I followed close behind, my coat drawn tightly against the wind. Behind us, Inspector Lestrade and Sir Ashcombe came more hesitantly, the baronet pale and gaunt, as if dreading what we might uncover. "Holmes," I called softly over the sound of the wind, "what is it you expect to find down here?" Holmes glanced at me, his face unreadable in the flickering light. "Answers, Watson, or at least evidence to confirm a theory that has begun to take shape." As we reached the heavy iron door of the vault, Sir Ashcombe fumbled with a large key, his hands trembling. "I have not been down here in years," he murmured, since her death." The door groaned on rusted hinges as it opened, revealing a narrow stairway that led deep underground. The air that met us was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and stone. We descended in silence, our footsteps echoing in the confined space, until we reached a wide chamber lined with stone. Sarcophagi. Dust lay thick upon them, and in the lantern's light the carved names of the Ashcombe ancestors stood out faintly. Holmes swept the light around until it fell upon a newer tomb, Lady Eleanor Ashcombe's final resting place. Sir Ashcombe stepped forward, his voice breaking. "My dear wife." Holmes remained still for a long moment, then moved toward a far wall where a smaller, unmarked door stood. It was secured with a modern lock, one that seemed oddly out of place in such an ancient room. "Curious," Holmes murmured, kneeling to examine it. "Tell me, Sir Ashcombe, are you aware of this door?" The baronet looked confused. "No, I've never seen it before." Holmes straightened, glancing at Lestrade. "Inspector, would you?" With a nod, Lestrade stepped forward, and using a set of tools from his pocket, worked at the lock until it clicked open. Holmes pushed the door inward, and we were greeted by a dark passage leading further underground. We exchanged glances but said nothing as Holmes led the way. The corridor was narrow, carved from stone, and led to a small chamber where strange equipment was stacked. Gears, pulleys, lengths of heavy rope, and what looked to be sections of broken lanterns and wheels, all coated in dust, but clearly related to the ghostly carriage. Holmes knelt to examine them. As I suspected, the mechanism for the phantom carriage, parts discarded when no longer needed. Lestrade stepped forward, frowning. "So this is where he hid the pieces. Alistair?" Holmes shook his head, eyes sharp. "Perhaps, but look here." Here, pointed to a leather-bound ledger resting on a stone shelf. "Records of expenses. Payments made to someone under initials that do not match Alistair's." He flipped through the pages as we gathered around. "Look, this entry. To R.M. for continued. Silence. Final payment. Who is R.M.?" Holmes mused aloud. Sir Ashcombe looked utterly bewildered. I don't know of anyone with those initials. At least no one connected to this house." Holmes closed the ledger thoughtfully. "Someone is orchestrating this from the shadows. Someone with knowledge of your family's secrets, and resources enough to threaten and pay off others." He turned to Sir Ashcombe suddenly. "My father was Sir Ashcombe's elder brother. This estate should have been his, but he was disinherited under cruel circumstances. Sir Ashcombe's marriage to Eleanor sealed my father's ruin, and mine after his death. My uncle offered me a place here out of pity, but I have always known what should rightfully be ours." Sir Ashcombe looked stricken. "Emily, I never knew you felt this way." "You never cared to ask," she snapped. "And when Eleanor died so suddenly, yes, I suspected. I still do. But what proof had I? None. So I found other means to reclaim what was taken from us." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And you enlisted Alistair's help?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he loved me once, long ago. He helped me create the ghostly carriage to frighten Sir Ashcombe, to make him believe the family curse was real. I thought he would surrender the estate in fear, and I could claim what should have been my father's legacy." Holmes regarded her with an unreadable expression. "But why continue after Alistair's death?" Her hands trembled as she answered. "Because someone else took over the scheme, someone who began to twist it for their own ends. I received threats even after I tried to stop. Someone else wanted to see Sir Ashcombe destroyed. I don't know who, only that I began to fear for my life." Holmes exchanged a sharp glance with Lestrade. "So there is yet another player in this game," he murmured. "Tell me, Miss Marchmont, do the initials R.M. mean anything to you?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I've never heard them." Before Holmes stood, his expression grave. "Miss Marchmont, your confession will be required by the authorities, but for now, I ask that you remain in this room and speak to no one. The true enemy may yet be among us." She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I never meant for anyone to die," she whispered. As we stepped out into the corridor, Sir Ashcombe leaned heavily against the wall, his face pale. "My own niece," he muttered. "I never suspected." Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sir Ashcombe, grief and resentment are powerful forces, but I believe there is someone else who has used these emotions for a darker purpose, someone who wishes not only to unseat you, but perhaps to end your life." Lestrade spoke up, his voice tense. "Holmes, who do you think it is?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I have a theory, but not yet proof. We must watch carefully, for I believe tonight will bring matters to a head." We left Sir Ashcombe to rest and returned to our rooms, the weight of revelation heavy upon us. Holmes stood at the window, watching the grey skies. "Watson," he said quietly, "the true enemy is still in the shadows, but not for long. Before another night falls, I shall know their name." Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. The day dragged on under a sky that never lifted from its sullen grey. A steady wind had begun to rise, rattling the window panes and moaning along the ancient halls of Ashcombe Manor. Holmes remained at the window for hours, his sharp gaze fixed on the winding path that led to the stables and the woods beyond. Lestrade and I sat quietly, respecting his silence. There was a tension in the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm that would break not only over the moors, but over the fate of everyone within these walls. By mid-afternoon, Sir Ashcombe joined us, looking weary and pale. "Holmes," he said softly, "do you truly believe there is still danger?" Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "More than ever, Sir Ashcombe. Tonight, I believe, the true architect of these horrors will make a final move. We must be ready." Sir Ashcombe sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. Emily's confession. What will become of her?" Lestrade answered, "That will depend on what else we uncover, sir. She is not without guilt, but if Holmes is right and someone else is behind this, we must expose them first." Holmes finally stepped away from the window and faced us all. "Gentlemen, tonight we will set a trap." "A trap?" I asked. He nodded. "I will write a note, to be left where it will surely reach the eyes of our hidden enemy. It will say that Sir Ashcombe intends to destroy the carriage remains at midnight, erasing all evidence of the ghostly hoax. If our enemy believes that, they may attempt something desperate to stop it, perhaps even revealing themselves." Lestrade's eyes gleamed with interest. "A dangerous game, Holmes." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "but we cannot wait. If we do nothing, I fear another death will follow." As dusk fell and the wind howled louder, Holmes sat at Sir Ashcombe's desk and carefully wrote the message. His hand was steady, but I could sense the weight of the moment in his furrowed brow. When it was done, he handed it to Lestrade. "Place this where anyone sneaking through the study would find it. Make sure it looks carelessly left, yet visible enough to tempt prying eyes." Lestrade took the note with a nod and vanished down the corridor. Meanwhile, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, tonight you will remain close to Sir Ashcombe. Guard him well. Do not let him out of your sight. I will take up watch in the great hall, and Lestrade will monitor the grounds." "And if the culprit makes a move?" I asked. Holmes's eyes glinted coldly. "Then we shall be ready." The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Dinner was a silent affair, with Sir Ashcombe eating little, Miss Marchmont absent in her rooms, and even the servants moving quietly, as though aware of the storm brewing inside as much as out. By 10 o'clock, Holmes took up his post in the great hall, seated in the shadows where he could watch both the main entrance and the study door. I stayed with Sir Ashcombe in the library, where a fire was kept burning high against the cold. Lestrade, bundled in his overcoat, paced near the stables and the back entrance, his sharp eyes watching for any sign of movement. Outside, the wind screamed, and rain lashed against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a shutter banged loose, clattering in the storm. Just before midnight, as Sir Ashcombe dozed fitfully in his chair, a sound reached my ears, faint but distinct over the howling wind, the creak of a floorboard. I tensed, glancing at Sir Ashcombe. He had not noticed. Rising quietly, I moved to the door and peered out into the dim hallway. Nothing, yet something was wrong. I could feel it. Suddenly, from the far end of the corridor, a soft, flickering light appeared. A lantern, carried by a shadowy figure moving swiftly and quietly. I slipped back into the library and gently shook Sir Ashcombe awake. "Sir, I believe someone is moving through the house." His eyes widened. "Holmes!" "Perhaps, but we must be ready. Sir Ashcombe rose, and we crept together to the door, peering out just in time to see the figure vanish around a corner toward the great hall. A moment later, a low cry rang out, a voice sharp and pained. "Holmes!" Drawing my revolver, I motioned Sir Ashcombe to remain hidden and hurried into the hallway. As I turned the corner, I saw Holmes grappling with a cloaked figure. The lantern had fallen, casting wild shadows as they struggled. Holmes was strong, but his opponent fought with desperate fury. Before I could intervene, Lestrade burst in from the opposite door, his own revolver drawn. "Stand back, Holmes!" he barked, advancing swiftly. The figure broke free, dashing for the door to the terrace. But Holmes, quick as lightning, seized them again, pulling back the hood that covered their face. A collective gasp escaped from all of us. Standing there, panting and wild-eyed, was Mr. Alistair's manservant, Thomas, the one who had seemed so mild, so loyal. Holmes's voice was ice. "So, Thomas, this was your game all along?" Thomas sneered, his calm mask shattered. "You'll never prove it all, Holmes. You think you're clever, but you've only seen half the truth." Lestrade stepped forward, snapping on the handcuffs. "We'll see what a judge thinks of that lad." As he was led away, Holmes turned to us. "Gentlemen, I believe the storm has broken, and now, at last, we shall uncover every secret of Ashcombe Manor." Chapter 10. The Final Unveiling. The storm raged outside, but within Ashcombe Manor, a heavy silence had settled after the struggle. Holmes stood in the centre of the great hall, his sharp gaze following Lestrade as he led Thomas away in iron cuffs. Sir Ashcombe and I joined Holmes, both of us shaken by the revelation. "Holmes," I asked, "how did you know it was Thomas? He was always so quiet, almost invisible in the household." Holmes gave a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. "Precisely, Watson. Sometimes those who are too quiet have the most to hide. It was the small things. A footprint near the stables that matched Thomas's boot, the way he lingered near Sir Alistair's study even when dismissed, and his suspicious knowledge of places in the house no servant should need to visit." Ian, Ashcombe shook his head in disbelief. But to think Thomas was behind the carriage's ghostly appearances! Why, he was Sir Alistair's trusted manservant for years. Holmes turned to him. "Trust is easily given, Sir Ashcombe, but not always wisely. Thomas had his reasons, desperation, greed, and, as I now suspect, revenge. We must speak to him further to understand everything." Lestrade re-entered, brushing rain from his coat. "He's locked up, Holmes, but he won't talk, at least not yet." Holmes nodded. "He will. But there's still one more thing we must do tonight." "Sir," Ashcombe frowned. "What is that?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "Find the place where Thomas kept the evidence, where he constructed the ghostly carriage and concealed the tools of his deception. Without that proof, he might slip away on mere circumstantial evidence." Lestrade and I exchanged glances. "And where do you think that is, Holmes?" I asked. Holmes turned toward the grand staircase. "There's one place we haven't searched thoroughly. The old east wing. Abandoned, dusty, and far from prying eyes. I believe we will find our answers there." With lanterns in hand, we followed Holmes up the creaking stairs, the manor groaning under the force of the storm. The east wing was a place of faded glory, its once grand rooms now cloaked in cobwebs and dust. Holmes led us to a locked door at the far end of the corridor. Producing a set of old keys he had taken from the butler earlier, he found the right button and slowly turned it in the lock. The door creaked open to reveal a dim, cluttered space, old furniture, broken trunks, and to our surprise, large wooden wheels, painted to resemble the spectral carriage, and pieces of harness and torn velvet that might once have adorned it. Holmes stepped in, examining everything with keen interest. "Here is where Thomas built his phantom," he said softly. "Look, false lanterns with blue glass to cast an eerie glow. A fog machine powered by chemicals to create the illusion of mist. Ingenious in its way, and deadly." Sir Ashcombe stared at the scene in horror. "All to frighten me to death, to make me believe my sins had returned to claim me." Holmes looked at him steadily. "Not just to frighten you, Sir Ashcombe. I believe Thomas hoped you would collapse under the strain, perhaps even take your own life. And with you gone, who would inherit Ashcombe Manor?" Sir Ashcombe paled. "Alistair, but he is dead." Holmes gave a sharp nod. "Exactly. But what if Alistair had an illegitimate heir? A secret that Thomas knew about, and perhaps hoped to use?" Sir Ashcombe sank onto a dusty chair. "Good heavens, could it be?" Lestrade exhaled. "We'll need to dig deep into the family's past, sir." Holmes picked up a bundle of letters from a table, scanning them quickly. "Here, letters from Sir Alistair to Thomas. They speak of debts, of promises to look after Thomas in return for his silence." Silence about what? Possibly about a child born in secret, an heir no one knew about. I leaned in. So Thomas wanted the estate to fall into his hands, or into the hands of someone he controlled? Holmes gave a grim smile. "Precisely, Watson." As Holmes examined one last trunk, he lifted a blood-stained glove from within, holding it up carefully. "And this, I fear, ties Thomas to Alistair's death. I believe the struggle near the stables was no accident. Thomas may have tried to persuade Alistair to help him, and when the man refused, he silenced him forever." Sir Ashcombe sat in stunned silence, while Lestrade took notes rapidly. Finally, Holmes straightened, lantern light reflecting in his sharp eyes. "Gentlemen, I believe we have enough now to ensure justice will be served." The storm outside began to lessen, as though nature itself recognized that the dark cloud hanging over Ashcombe Manor had at last begun to lift. Holmes turned to Sir Ashcombe. "I suggest, sir, that tomorrow we bring this evidence to the magistrate. And as for your family, perhaps it is time to uncover any hidden truths before others seek to use them against you." Sir Ashcombe nodded slowly. "You are right, Mr. Holmes. You have my deepest gratitude for saving not only my life, but the name of Ashcombe as well." Holmes gave a polite bow. "It is what I do, sir." With that, we turned to leave the East Wing, leaving behind the shadows of the past as the first light of dawn began to pierce the storm clouds. Chapter 11. Epilogue. Ashcombe's new dawn weeks had passed since the stormy night when Holmes exposed the truth behind the haunting of Ashcombe Manor. The spring sun now shone warmly over the estate, banishing the last remnants of winter's chill. and perhaps, too, the darkness that had gripped the manor. Sir Ashcombe stood at the edge of the estate gardens, overlooking the rolling hills. The once fearsome apparition of the ghostly carriage was now nothing but a fading memory. The villagers, who had spoken in hushed tones of curses and spirits, now greeted Sir Ashcombe with respect once more, knowing justice had been done. Holmes and I had returned to Ashcombe at Sir Ashcombe's request, though this time as honoured guests rather than investigators. As we sat on the terrace sipping tea, Sir Ashcombe turned to Holmes with a thoughtful expression. "I never had the chance to ask you, Mr. Holmes. Do you think Thomas acted alone in all of this?" Holmes, leaning back in his chair, gazed across the lawn. "I believe he was the mastermind, yes. But he may have been spurred on by secrets long, buried within your family. The letters we discovered suggest Sir Alistair carried a heavy burden, a secret that perhaps Thomas used to manipulate him." Sir Ashcombe looked down, his face shadowed with regret. "A secret heir. If that is true, then part of this tragedy was of our own making." Holmes gave a nod. "Indeed, Sir Ashcombe. But now you have the chance to set things right. Investigate the truth behind those letters. If there is an heir, it is better that they be found in honesty rather than allowing vultures to circle." Ashcombe looked resolute. "I shall take your advice, Mr. Holmes. The past has caused enough pain." Lestrade, who had also joined us, looked much more relaxed now that the case was officially closed. "Thomas will answer for Alistair's murder. He's already confessed to setting up the ghostly carriage to terrify Sir Ashcombe into handing over the estate. He thought he could force you into surrender through fear alone." Holmes added, "And when fear wasn't enough, he turned to more direct means. Fortunately, we were able to stop him before tragedy struck again." As we finished our tea, Sir Ashcombe stood and looked up at the clear sky. "You've given me back my home, Mr. Holmes, and my peace of mind. I shall never forget that." Holmes rose, adjusting his coat. "I ask for no gratitude, Sir Ashcombe, but I hope you remember this. Truth, no matter how well hidden, always finds its way to the surface. It is better to face it bravely than to let it fester in the dark." Sir Ashcombe smiled faintly. "Wise words, Mr. Holmes. Words I shall live by." As Holmes and I prepared to leave Ashcombe Manor for the final time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle over the old estate. The shadows had been lifted, and though the past could never be entirely erased, the future now seemed clearer. As we climbed into our carriage for the return journey to London, Holmes lit his pipe, looking thoughtful as ever. "Another case closed. Holmes," I said. He gave a small smile. "Yes, Watson. And like all great puzzles, this one had its share of twists. But in the end, the truth prevailed." As the manor disappeared behind us, I leaned back and looked at my friend. "What will be our next adventure, Holmes?" Holmes exhaled a plume of smoke, eyes twinkling. "The world is full of mysteries, Watson. I dare say we won't have to wait long before another calls for our attention." And with that, we rode into the horizon, ready for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 12. The quiet return to Baker Street. It was late in the evening when Holmes and I finally returned to our familiar lodgings at 231B Baker Street, the city lamps casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. Though the train from Ashcombe had been uneventful, My mind was still alive with the remnants of the mystery we had solved, its layers of deception and the human frailties behind them. Holmes moved with his usual quiet efficiency, removing his coat and setting aside his hat. The fireplace glowed softly, throwing flickering light upon the room that had witnessed so many of our past adventures. As I sat down in my chair and reached for my journal, Holmes glanced at me with a faint smile. "You are already preparing to write, Watson?" he asked, striking a match to light his pipe. "Indeed," I replied, leaning back. "It was a case worthy of record, Holmes, the kind of story that readers will scarcely believe, though every word is true. A ghostly carriage, a family curse, and, beneath it all, cold, calculating murder." Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke and regarded me with sharp eyes. "You must be careful, Watson. When you write this account, ensure that it is the human story you emphasize, not merely the theatrics of the so-called haunting." I nodded, understanding his meaning. "You refer to Thomas's jealousy, his manipulation of family secrets, and Sir Alister's quiet shame?" "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "In the end, Watson, it is rarely the supernatural that lies behind such dramas. It is greed, resentment, guilt, human passions, plain and simple. People are more inclined to believe in ghosts than to accept the bitter truths of the human heart." He walked over to the window, gazing out onto the street, where the night passed quietly, untroubled by the turmoil we had left behind at Ashcombe. "Still," I said thoughtfully, "one cannot help but wonder. If Sir Alister had confessed his secret earlier, might tragedy have been avoided?" Holmes turned, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Perhaps. But people rarely confess what shames them most, Watson. Sir Alister likely believed he was protecting his family, his name. In doing so, he handed Thomas the very weapon that would destroy him." There was a long silence between us, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, Holmes sat down across from me, pipe in hand. "Do you recall, Watson, what I said when the case first began?" I thought for a moment and smiled. "You said that there is always a reason behind the impossible, if only one looks closely enough." "Indeed," Holmes said softly, "and that remains true. Whether it be a phantom carriage or a locked room, there is always a thread that leads from the shadow of illusion to the light of reality." With that, Holmes leaned back, closing his eyes, a look of rare calm upon his features. I let him rest, but as I dipped my pen in ink and turned to a fresh page in my journal, I knew that I would do justice to the case, recording not only the chilling mystery, but also the poignant truths it had revealed. For though the haunted carriage would no longer ride the roads of Ashcombe, its echoes would remain in the hearts of those touched by its grim passage, and Holmes, ever vigilant, would be ready for the next shadow to cross our path. As I began to write, I glanced once more at Holmes. And though his eyes were now closed, I had no doubt that his mind was already working on the next enigma that the world would bring to our door. Thus ended the case of the haunted carriage, another triumph of reason over fear and of truth over deception. Chapter 13. A final reflection on shadows and men. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, the kind of sky that seemed to press upon the rooftops of London, heavy with unshed rain. I awoke to the faint clinking of teacups and the rustle of the morning paper. As Mrs. Hudson, in her usual efficient manner, laid out breakfast for us. Holmes was already seated by the window, his profile sharp against the dull light, a newspaper spread open in his hands. He did not turn as I entered, but gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Watson," he said without looking up, "you will be pleased to learn that the Times reports Scotland Yard has accepted full credit for the resolution of the Ashcombe affair. Inspector Lestrade, in particular, is noted for his keen investigative work." I chuckled softly as I sat down and poured myself a cup of tea. It seems, Holmes, that once again the official forces of law and order are victorious in the public eye, while the man who truly solved the mystery remains in the shadows. Holmes folded the newspaper neatly and laid it aside, fixing me with one of his penetrating gazes. "My dear Watson, if I sought public recognition, I would have long since abandoned my methods for something more suitable to the popular imagination, perhaps gallant speeches and dramatic arrests. But the truth, Watson, the truth is a quieter satisfaction." I nodded, though I could not entirely share his indifference to praise. Still, it was a case unlike many others. There was something profoundly tragic about it, Holmes. Sir Alister's guilt, Thomas's greed, the old legends turned into tools for murder. It leaves one wondering about the nature of belief and deception. Holmes steepled his fingers and leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You touch upon a matter that lies at the very heart of this case, Watson. What is it, I wonder, that makes men so susceptible to fear? To shadows that have no substance?" He paused, glancing out the window, as if searching for an answer in the fog of the city beyond. In Ashcombe, we saw how a man, burdened by his past, allowed a myth to govern his life. Sir Alister was imprisoned not by any ghost, but by his own guilt and secrecy. Thomas, in turn, used that prison to his advantage, shaping terror into a weapon. Holmes rose, moving to the fireplace where he struck a match and lit his pipe, the smoke curling upwards in thin spirals. "Fear, Watson, is a more potent force than most realize. It bends reason, distorts perception, and blinds even the wisest of men. And yet," he said, turning back to me, "the solution to fear is always the same. Truth, cold, unyielding, and brilliant as steel." He smiled faintly, though there was a sharpness to it. If anything is to be learned from Ashcombe, it is that darkness thrives where men refuse to confront their own deeds. Ghosts, my friend, are often nothing more than guilt given form. I sipped my tea, pondering his words as silence settled between us, a comfortable silence born of many shared thoughts. Finally, Holmes broke the stillness with a wry smile. "But enough of philosophy, Watson. No doubt by tomorrow some other puzzle will arrive at our door. A letter, a troubled visitor, a curious headline. The world does not pause for long." I smiled in return, knowing full well the truth of his statement. Yet in that moment I felt a certain peace, a rare thing after such a case. Holmes, resuming his place by the window, looked out thoughtfully. "Let them believe in their ghosts, Watson. We shall remain here, seeking only what is real." And with that, Sherlock Holmes and I sat in the quiet morning, two men bound not by fame, but by the relentless pursuit of truth, undaunted by shadows, and always ready to confront the next mystery that might arise from the fog beyond Baker Street. Chapter 14. The Whisper of the Carriage. Several days had passed since the events at Ashcombe Hall, and life at Baker Street had returned to its usual rhythm. Yet, despite the passage of time, I found my mind often drifting back to that windswept estate and the ghostly carriage that had stirred so much fear. Holmes, for his part, had thrown himself into his chemical experiments with renewed energy, as though eager to banish the remnants of the case from his mind. But even he, I noticed, would sometimes pause and stare thoughtfully into the fire, his brows drawn together in silent contemplation. It was on such an evening, as the rain tapped steadily against the windows, that I broached the subject. "Holmes," I began, setting aside my medical journal, "have you thought much of Ashcombe since our return?" He glanced up from his armchair, where he had been lazily watching the smoke from his pipe swirl toward the ceiling. "Indeed, Watson," he said quietly, "more than I care to admit." There was a pause, during which only the crackling of the fire filled the room. Then Holmes continued, "It is not the unravelling of the crime that lingers in my mind. It is the people, the tragedy. Sir Alistair, a man who lived with ghosts of his own making, and young Clara, left to bear the weight of his sins." He rose and moved to the window, parting the curtain slightly to gaze at the mist-covered street below. "You see, Watson," he said without turning, "we solved the mystery of the haunted carriage, exposed the trickery and treachery, and yet I wonder if, in some way, the ghosts that haunt men's hearts are ever truly laid to rest." His words struck me deeply. I, too, had felt an unease I could not quite name. "I confess, Holmes," I said, "though I know there was nothing supernatural at work, I can't help but hear in my mind the echo of wheels on gravel, the carriage that was never there." Holmes smiled faintly at that, though his eyes remained distant. "Perhaps, Watson," he mused, "it is because the true ghosts we encountered were not those of Ashcombe's past, but of human conscience and fear. Such things do not vanish simply, because we have exposed their material cause." He turned from the window, the sharpness returning to his gaze. "And yet," he added, "that is why we do what we do, is it not? To shine light into the shadows, even if we cannot banish them entirely. A man may not forget his guilt, but he need not be destroyed by it, if only he faces the truth." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. Holmes moved back to his chair and picked up his violin. He ran the bow across the strings, drawing out a soft, mournful melody that seemed to capture the lingering sorrow of Ashcombe itself. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and as I listened to Holmes play, I realized that though the haunted carriage had been unmasked as a deception, its echoes, like so many memories of past wrongs, might forever ride through the night. Yet in Holmes's quiet music and his calm resolve, there was also comfort, the knowledge that, so long as there were men like him to seek the truth, the darkness would never fully triumph. And so we sat, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, as the strains of the violin filled the room, an elegy for Ashcombe and for all the haunted souls who walk among us. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The drawing-room of Ashcombe Hall was once again filled with all the principal players in this strange and harrowing drama. Evening had fallen, casting long shadows from the flickering lamps, and though the storm had passed, the air still carried the weight of recent events. Sir Alister, pale and hollow-eyed, sat rigidly in a high-backed chair near the fireplace. His niece Clara stood behind him, her hands nervously twisting a handkerchief. Beside them, Inspector Lestrade surveyed the room with his usual air of impatient scepticism, while Mr. Greeley, the solicitor, sat stiffly at the edge of his chair, a sheen of perspiration on his brow. Near the window stood Mr. Arkwright, the stable-master, his arms folded and expression guarded, and finally, in a shadowed corner, the butler, Mr. Price, lingered as if trying to fade from notice. Holmes stood at the centre of the room, his gaze sharp as ever, but his manner oddly calm, as though savouring the final moments before an inevitable revelation. I watched him from a seat near the window, eager to see how he would draw the net tight around the true culprit. "My friends," Holmes began, his voice smooth and precise, "we have come to the end of a most perplexing affair, a tale of deception, fear, and carefully orchestrated illusion. Tonight, I propose to lay before you the entire truth of the so-called haunted carriage, and the dark secret it was meant to conceal." There was a murmur among those present, and I could see Lestrade's sceptical glance, as if daring Holmes to provide anything concrete. Holmes continued, undeterred. "First, let us recall the facts as they were presented. A ghostly carriage, heard but never seen, arriving at the hall. A series of unexplained noises, footprints in the gravel, and Sir Alister's growing terror. At first glance, these phenomena suggest the supernatural. But as we know, gentlemen, there are always more earthly explanations, if one looks close enough." Holmes turned towards Sir Alister. "Sir, you told us that the haunting began shortly after. You revised your will. A curious coincidence, until one examines the motive." Sir Alister shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Holmes began to pace slowly. "Someone stood to gain greatly from your death, Sir Alister. But they needed more than a mere accident. They needed to drive you to madness or a fatal stroke, so that your passing would seem natural, unremarkable. Hence the creation of a phantom carriage playing on an old family legend and your own private guilt." Clara gasped softly, but Holmes pressed on. "The carriage sounds were no mystery once I discovered the clever arrangement of metal plates beneath the gravel drive, placed in such a way that when the concealed mechanism was activated, it would produce the unmistakable sound of wheels. And hooves. I found the remnants of this device buried near the stables, where only one man had regular access. All eyes turned toward Mr. Arkwright, who stiffened but said nothing. Holmes's gaze, however, swept past him to the butler, Mr. Price. And yet the stable-master was not the one with the keenest motive, nor the skill to orchestrate such a deception. No, that honour belongs to someone with a far more personal grievance. Someone whose livelihood, whose very future, depended on Sir Alister's favour. Price looked up sharply, his face now drained of all colour. Holmes turned, facing him fully. "Shall I recount, Mr. Price, how you overheard Sir Alister's intention to cut you out of his will? How you realised that Clara would inherit everything, leaving you penniless? You had served this house for decades, and yet your loyalty was to yourself." The butler opened his mouth as if to speak, but Holmes raised a hand to silence him. "And let us not forget the key clue, the scent of oil and the faint metallic filings I discovered near the terrace, which led me to the hidden mechanism. Udnir, someone with access to the private areas of the hall, could have set such a thing in motion. Someone like the trusted butler, always unseen, always nearby. Price's hands trembled visibly now, and Clara covered her mouth in shock. "But what sealed your fate, Mr. Price," Holmes said quietly, "was your attempt to destroy the evidence. The second time I examined the drive, the plates had been removed, but too late. I had already seen enough." Lestrade rose from his seat, his expression a mixture of admiration and grim resolve. "So, Price," the inspector said coldly, "it was you all along?" Price, his composure shattered, slumped into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. "I had nothing left," he whispered hoarsely. "After all these years of service, nothing. And she," he gestured toward Clara, "would have taken everything." There was a long silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Finally, Holmes spoke again, his voice softer now. "Fear and greed, gentlemen, are often the truest ghosts that haunt men's hearts." Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The silence that followed Mr. Price's confession was deep and heavy, like the last echoes of thunder after a passing storm. Sir Alister sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the man he had trusted for so many years. Clara clung to the back of her uncle's chair, her face pale and drawn. Holmes stood at the centre of the room, calmly observing everyone before finally beginning to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "since we are now in possession of the truth, allow me to lay out, step by step, how this crime was conceived and how its unravelling became inevitable." All eyes turned to him, the atmosphere tense yet expectant. First, Holmes began. The motive. Mr. Price feared being left destitute after Sir Alister's revised will, which he learned about through careful eavesdropping, an art he had long since mastered in this house. Rather than confront Sir Alister, he devised a more insidious plan, to frighten him to death, thereby securing his future under the existing will. Holmes slowly paced the room, his voice clear and steady. Second, the means. Mr. Price was no mere servant. He was a man of clever hands and a clever mind, and he knew every secret of Ashcombe Hall. In the dead of night, he installed metal plates beneath the gravel drive, thin enough to be unnoticed, yet strong enough to produce the sounds of a carriage when connected to a mechanical contraption powered by a hand-cranked motor hidden in the stable's shadows. I nodded to myself, recalling the strange metallic scent Holmes had detected earlier, an observation that now made perfect sense. Third, the method of fear. Holmes continued. Price did not rely on sound alone. He manipulated other details, moving objects within Sir Alister's rooms, opening and closing windows to let in sudden draughts, and even releasing traces of smoke and light to simulate the presence of ghostly figures. Clara gasped softly. "But how?" she asked, her voice trembling. Holmes turned to her kindly. "Simple devices, Miss Clara. A lantern set with coloured glass to create an eerie glow and placed strategically outside the window. Small mirrors angled to reflect that light into the room. And, of course, a deep knowledge of Sir Alister's old superstitions." Sir Alister gave a weak nod, as though acknowledging the depth of his own vulnerability. Holmes went on. The final piece of this macabre puzzle was psychological. Mr. Price knew of Sir Alister's guilt over the death of his brother, a tragedy connected to that very legend of the ghostly carriage. He used that knowledge to awaken old fears, driving Sir Alister deeper into his own imagination until reality and fiction blurred. Inspector Lestrade, who had been quietly taking notes, now looked up sharply. "And the night when Sir Alister nearly collapsed from fright?" Lestrade asked. Holmes smiled thinly. "Ah, yes. That night Mr. Price timed everything to perfection. He activated the mechanism as Sir Alister sat by the window, ensuring the sounds of the carriage would reach him at his weakest moment. He even went so far as to appear as a shadowy figure reflected in the glass, to make Sir Alister believe the ghost itself had come." A collective shudder passed through the room. "And what about the footprints we found outside?" I asked, curious about that crucial clue. Holmes nodded approvingly at my question. "Ah, Watson, sharp as always. Mr. Price wore old horseshoes strapped to his boots to leave the impression of hooves in the gravel. A clever trick, but one that, upon close examination, betrayed itself by the uniformity of the print and lack of natural variation." Lestrade snorted. "And here I was thinking we had a real haunting on our hands." Holmes gave a rare smile. "Even the most rational minds may be fooled when fear takes hold, Inspector. Sir Alister finally found his voice, though it was weak. And the money? Was that his only reason?" Holmes turned to him gently. "Greed and desperation, Sir Alister. After a lifetime of service, Mr. Price could not bear to lose what he believed was owed to him. But fear of the future, drove him to create fear in you." Holmes paused, then added in a softer tone, "It is a lesson, Sir Alister, that trust should not be given blindly, and that even those closest to us may harbour secrets we cannot imagine." Price sat silently, his head bowed in defeat. Lestrade stood up. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I suppose it's time to take Mr. Price into custody. He'll answer for this at Scotland Yard." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, Inspector. Let justice do its part." As Lestrade moved to take Price away, I watched Holmes closely. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep contemplative sadness, as if the case had left behind shadows that even he could not quite dispel. And as the door closed behind them, the last echoes of the phantom carriage seemed to fade into the night, replaced at last by the stillness of truth. Chapter 17. Aftermath. Holmes reflects on the case. The rain had begun to fall gently as Holmes and I left Ashcombe Hall, the dark clouds parting just enough to let the pale moon peek through. The house behind us now seemed quieter, emptied of its secrets, though still weighed down by the echoes of recent events. We walked in silence for some time, the gravel crunching softly beneath our feet. Holmes was unusually thoughtful, his sharp gaze turned inward, as though still unravelling threads within his mind. Finally, I broke the silence. "You were right all along, Holmes. There was no ghost, only human greed and fear." Holmes glanced at me with a faint smile, but there was little satisfaction in his eyes. "Yes, Watson," he said quietly. "It was always human hands behind the mystery. And yet, in some ways, that makes it far more tragic. I looked at him curiously. Tragic? He nodded, clasping his hands behind his back as we walked. Consider it, Watson. Here was a man, Mr. Price, who had devoted his entire life to the service of Sir Alister. Instead of earning the respect and security he sought, he allowed bitterness and fear to fester within him. Rather than confront his fate with dignity, he turned to deception and terror to secure what he felt was his due. Holmes paused, looking up at the moonlit sky. And Sir Alister himself, haunted more by his own past than by any phantom. His brother's death weighed heavily on him, and that guilt made him vulnerable to believing in the legend of the haunted carriage. Sometimes, Watson, our own minds create the ghosts that torment us. I was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. You believe Sir Alister will recover from this? I asked. Holmes sighed. In time, perhaps. Now that he knows the truth, he may find peace. But wounds of the mind heal slowly. Clara will need to be strong for him. We reached the gates of Ashcombe Hall, pausing to look back at the great house. Its windows were dark, save for one glowing light in Sir Alister's study. Holmes followed my gaze and spoke again, softer this time. It is always the same, Watson. Strip away the layers of superstition and myth, and you find the raw, human elements: fear, greed, guilt, desperation. These are the true ghosts that haunt us. He turned to me with a wry smile. And yet, people will always prefer to believe in the fantastic rather than face the mundane truths of life. A haunted carriage is far easier to accept than the idea that a trusted friend might betray you. I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. And what of Mr. Price? I asked quietly. Holmes's eyes grew distant. He will answer to the law, as he must. But I cannot help but wonder, Watson, how many like him walk among us, those who feel cornered by life, desperate enough to do the unthinkable. We began walking again, this time toward the distant lights of the village where Lestrade awaited us. Still, Holmes added, glancing at me with a flicker of light in his eyes, there is some satisfaction in knowing that truth has prevailed, however painful that truth may be. I smiled slightly, knowing that for Holmes the pursuit of truth was both a calling and a burden. And you, Holmes, will this case linger in your mind? He gave a soft chuckle. Perhaps for a while, Watson. After all, a case where fear is the true culprit leaves much to reflect upon. As we made our way down the long drive, the sound of our footsteps mingling with the soft patter of rain, I realized that though the mystery had been solved, its lessons would stay with us for some time to come. And somewhere, in the distant echo of the wind through the trees, it was as if the last whispers of the haunted carriage were finally fading, leaving behind only the quiet truth of human frailty. Chapter 18. Return to Baker Street. Holmes and Watson conclude the adventure. Several days had passed since the dramatic conclusion at Ashcombe Hall. The countryside, though beautiful in its spring awakening, now seemed a world away, as Holmes and I resumed our familiar life within the walls of 121B Baker Street. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, as I sat in my usual chair, watching Holmes prepare his pipe with deliberate care. A thick fog pressed against the window panes outside, muffling the sound of distant carriages in the London streets. "Holmes," I said at last, breaking the long silence that had settled between us since our return, "I cannot help but think of Sir Alister and all that transpired. It was unlike any case we have had, was it not?" Holmes looked up at me, one eyebrow slightly raised, as he struck a match and lit his pipe. "In some respects, yes, Watson, and yet, in others, it was as familiar as any case involving the darker side of human nature." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a thin stream of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. "Fear, my dear fellow. Fear remains the most potent force that drives men to madness, to crime, and sometimes even to ruin themselves without the hand of another." I nodded thoughtfully. "And yet," I said, "there were moments, Holmes, when even I doubted your reasoning, when all signs pointed towards something beyond reason." Holmes gave a rare smile. "That is precisely the effect our friend, Mr. Price, intended. A clever manipulation of the mind, exploiting legends and fears already rooted in the heart of Ashcombe Hall. It was not merely a crime of action, Watson, but a crime of the mind, designed to unsettle and confuse." He tapped his pipe thoughtfully against the armrest. "And what of Inspector Lestrade?" I asked, recalling the man's rather begrudging admiration at the end of the affair. Holmes gave a soft chuckle. "Lestrade, I imagine, has already written his official report claiming all credit for the resolution, though he did seem somewhat more generous than usual in acknowledging my role. No doubt Scotland Yard will sleep easier tonight, believing that the world of the supernatural has been banished by simple police work." I smiled, though I knew Holmes held no bitterness for Lestrade's ambitions. "And Sir Alister?" I asked more quietly. Holmes grew pensive for a moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I received a note this morning," he said, reaching into his pocket and unfolding a letter with Sir Alister's familiar, slanted handwriting. "He writes to say that, although shaken, he finds some measure of peace now that the truth is known. He intends to leave Ashcombe Hall for a time, seeking quiet refuge in the country with his niece, Miss Clara." I nodded, relieved to hear of some solace found amid the sorrow. "And Price?" Holmes's face grew serious. "Awaiting trial. His fate lies now with the courts, though it would not surprise me if the weight of his own conscience is the greater punishment." For a while, neither of us spoke, the fire's crackle filling the quiet space. Finally, Holmes looked at me with a glint of that familiar sharpness in his eyes. "You know, Watson, though this case is at its end, the matter of human folly never truly ceases. I expect it won't be long before someone arrives at that door." He gestured toward the entrance, bringing another puzzle to unravel. I smiled. "And when they do, Holmes, you shall be ready." He inclined his head slightly. "Indeed. Until then, Watson, I shall take comfort in our fire and in your company. But when the game calls, you and I will be at it again." With that, he leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, as though savouring the quiet before the next storm. And as I looked out at the fog swirling beyond the windows of Baker Street, I could not help but wonder what new mystery would next find its way into Holmes' hands. But for now, I was content, knowing that once again reason had triumphed over fear, and that, as ever, I would be by Holmes's side when the shadows next stirred. Chapter 19. Epilogue. The final reflection on the haunted carriage. Mystery. It was a week after our return to Baker Street that I found Holmes once again deep in thought, seated by the window with the faint morning light, casting long shadows across the room. The case of Ashcombe Hall had been laid to rest in the public mind, but for Holmes and myself the echoes lingered. I sat across from him, sipping tea, watching as he absently turned a letter-opener in his hand, his sharp eyes unfocused, yet clearly lost in silent deduction. "Holmes," I said softly, "you have been unusually quiet since our return. Does the matter of the haunted carriage still weigh upon you?" He glanced up at me, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not the carriage, Watson," he said quietly, "but rather what it represented. You see, there are few cases in my career where reason and imagination have been so dangerously intertwined." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Consider this, Watson. A man of intellect and means, Sir Alister, brought to the brink of madness, not by a tangible enemy, but by the phantoms of guilt and fear expertly manipulated by another man's cunning. It is a powerful reminder of how fragile the human mind can be." I nodded, remembering the desperation in Sir Alister's eyes. "And yet," Holmes continued, "it was not only Sir Alister who stood at the edge. You and I, Watson, faced moments of doubt. Even I, accustomed to seeking logic in all things, found myself standing before that carriage in the mist, questioning for a fleeting moment whether something beyond reason might be at play. The admission surprised me, though I knew Holmes well enough to recognize his rare moments of candour. "But in the end, Holmes," I said gently, "you uncovered the truth, as you always do. You showed that even the most terrifying apparitions have a human hand behind them." He gave a soft chuckle. "Perhaps, Watson. But what lingers in my mind is the realization that the line between fear and reality is thinner than we admit, and that men like Price, who understand that line, can wield it as a weapon far more dangerous than any knife or gun." A heavy silence fell between us as I considered his words. Outside, the city was waking to another grey morning, the sound of horses' hooves and wheels echoing along Baker Street. Holmes stood suddenly, moving to the window. "I wonder, Watson," he said, peering out at the fog that still clung to the streets, "how many others live haunted by their own minds, by fears others can exploit, and how many crimes go unseen because they wear the mask of a ghost story." He turned back to me, his gaze sharp now, the familiar glint of purpose returning. "It is for us, Watson, for those who seek truth, to pierce that veil, to remind the world that reason, though sometimes fragile, is still our greatest defence against the darkness." I rose, standing beside him as we looked out upon London. "And should such darkness rise again, Holmes," I said, "you will be there to shine a light upon it." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Indeed, Watson, indeed." The fog swirled and shifted beyond the glass, but inside 221B Baker Street there was clarity, at least for now. As I set down my cup and reached for my notebook, I knew that the story of the haunted carriage was not only one of crime and deception, but a testament to the power of reason to triumph over fear. And I, as ever, would be here to record the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, wherever they might take us next. Chapter 20. Aftermath and New Beginnings. Several days had passed since Holmes's profound reflection on the haunted carriage affair. Life at Baker Street was beginning to return to its usual rhythm, if there could ever be such a thing as usual in the company of Sherlock Holmes. The Morning Post lay scattered across the breakfast table, and Holmes sat reading a letter with a mixture of boredom and faint amusement. I was reviewing my notes on the case, considering how best to present this astonishing adventure to the public, when Holmes broke the silence. "Watson," he said, folding the letter with precise care, "it appears that Sir Alister is recovering well. His physicians report a gradual return to sound health, now that the shadow of guilt and deception has been lifted from his mind." I smiled at the news. "I'm glad to hear it, Holmes. After all he endured, it is only fitting he should find peace again." Holmes gave a nod, though his eyes were distant, as if already turning to other matters. "Interestingly," he added, "Miss Edith plans to return to Ashcombe Hall to oversee its restoration. It seems she has resolved to breathe life back into a house that has seen too much death." "She is a strong woman," I observed. "Far stronger than anyone gave her credit for at the beginning." Holmes gave a faint smile, an expression of approval. "Indeed, Watson, it is often those who remain silent in the shadows that prove themselves strongest when the storm comes." There was a pause before I ventured, "And what of Mr. Price?" Holmes's smile vanished. "Price has been remanded in custody. His trial will soon commence, and though he has attempted to plead madness, I believe the evidence will be more than sufficient to show his clear and deliberate malice." I exhaled, thinking of the man who had woven such an elaborate web of terror. And yet, Holmes mused, one wonders how many others, less cunning but equally desperate, might be tempted to similar deeds if they perceive fear as a tool to manipulate. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with another tray of letters and a telegram. Holmes took the telegram, scanning it quickly. A faint glint returned to his eyes, the glint I knew so well. "It appears, Watson," he said with growing interest, "that Scotland Yard requests our assistance on a new matter, one involving a curious theft at a country estate. Diamonds, missing documents, and, intriguingly, a footprint that vanishes mid-path." He handed me the telegram, watching with amusement as I read the brief yet tantalizing message. "Shall we accept, Holmes?" I asked eagerly. He stood already reaching for his coat and hat, his energy restored. "Naturally, Watson. After all, what is life without a puzzle to solve? The haunted carriage has been laid to rest, but London and its environs are never without mystery. As I gathered my own coat, I paused to look around the room, at the papers, the remnants of our past case, the smoke curling from Holmes's long pipe. "To think," I said softly, "that only days ago we were standing in the fog, doubting even ourselves." Holmes clapped me on the shoulder, a rare gesture of camaraderie. "And that, Watson, is why we must always seek the truth, however well it is hidden." With that, we stepped out into the morning mist, the city beyond brimming with secrets yet to be uncovered, and as Holmes strode confidently ahead, I knew that whatever mystery awaited, we would face it together. Chapter 21. The Shadow Beyond the Smoke. It was a quiet evening in Baker Street, several weeks after the resolution of the haunted carriage case. The gas lamps cast a soft glow against the windows, and the fire burned low, embers crackling in the hearth. Holmes sat in his armchair, long legs crossed, his sharp profile outlined against the flickering light. I had been reviewing my final notes on the case, making minor adjustments before preparing them for publication. Yet my mind, like Holmes, seemed unable to leave behind the lingering echoes of that dreadful night at Ashcombe Hall. Breaking the silence, I ventured, "Holmes, if I may ask, what was it about this case that unsettled you so? You were more pensive than usual." Holmes, who had been staring into the fire, turned his keen gaze upon me. "Watson," he said slowly, "it is not often that I find myself facing not only a human puzzle, but also the raw fear that dwells in men's minds. The kind of fear that can be manipulated like a puppet on a string." I leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean the fear Sir Alister carried with him?" "Yes," Holmes answered thoughtfully. "But more than that, the way Price used that fear as a weapon. Most crimes are committed for money, revenge, or love gone astray. But to weave terror itself into the very fabric of a man's life, to haunt him with shadows of the past, that, Watson, is a subtler, more dangerous game." He reached for his pipe, lighting it with a match that glowed briefly in the dim room. Wisps of smoke curled upwards, twisting and vanishing. "I have long said that when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Yet sometimes, Watson, what remains is not merely improbable. It is a reflection of the darker corners of human nature, those places we rarely look into." I nodded, watching as Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his expression unreadable. "And what of Price?" I asked. "A man capable of such cruelty. Do you believe he felt remorse?" Holmes gave a short, humourless laugh. "Remorse? No, Watson. Men like Price are architects of their own destruction. They see others as pawns in their grand design, and when that design collapses, they feel nothing but bitterness at their own failure." He paused, then added in a quieter voice, "But what troubles me more is how easily fear can be used, how fragile the human mind becomes when it is left alone with shadows. Sir Alister, for all his title and wealth, was a prisoner in his own house, caged not by bars, but by the past." The room was still for a moment, save for the ticking of the clock and the soft crackle of the fire. "Holmes," I said gently, "you did free him. You freed him from that prison." Holmes looked at me, a faint smile touching the corners of his lips. "Perhaps," he said. "But, Watson, the world is filled with such prisons. Some built by others, some built by ourselves." He leaned back, lost in thought, as the fire dimmed to glowing embers. "Still," he murmured, almost to himself, "for every shadow there must be a light. And perhaps in our small way we bring that light when we uncover the truth." I said nothing more, sensing that Holmes had reached the depth of his reflections for the night. As I gathered my papers, preparing to retire, I glanced once more at my friend, the man who, for all his brilliance, carried his own invisible shadows. Yet I knew, as always, that when the next case arose, Sherlock Holmes would stand ready, not only to solve mysteries of crime, but to pierce the shadows that darken men's souls. and with that thought I left him to his quiet contemplation, as the city outside drifted into midnight silence. Chapter 22. A Knock at Midnight. The night was unusually still on Baker Street. The moon, pale and watchful, bathed the fog-draped street in a silver glow. I had long since retired to my room, my mind still restless with the memories of our recent adventure at Ashcombe Hall. Yet just as the clock chimed midnight, a sharp knock echoed through the sitting-room. I stirred, uncertain if I had imagined the sound, but as it came again, 3 rapid knocks, followed by a pause and a fourth, I knew it was real. Grabbing my dressing-gown, I hurried into the sitting-room to find Holmes already there, fully dressed, as though he had anticipated the visitor. His sharp eyes met mine, and he gestured for silence as he moved to the door. With a smooth motion, he opened it. A tall, cloaked figure stood in the threshold, face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. But what caught my attention most was the gloved hand holding a sealed envelope, the red wax glinting faintly in the dim gaslight. Holmes took the envelope with a nod, his expression unreadable. "You are expected, Mr. Holmes," the stranger said, in a low, urgent voice. "There is little time. It concerns—" He hesitated, glancing at me. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You may speak freely. Dr. Watson is my closest companion." The man gave a slight bow. "It concerns a death, one that should not have been possible." With that cryptic message, he turned on his heel and vanished into the night, leaving only the faint echo of his footsteps behind. I turned to Holmes, who was studying the envelope, fingers lightly tracing the wax seal. "Another case?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Holmes gave a thin smile, eyes glinting with anticipation. "Indeed, Watson, and by the tone of our visitor, a matter both delicate and dangerous." He broke the seal, unfolding the parchment inside. His eyes scanned the page, his expression darkening slightly. "What is it, Holmes?" I pressed. He handed me the paper. Scrawled in hurried script were the words, "If you value the lives of those in London, come at once. The hourglass has been shattered, and with it, time itself bleeds." I looked up in confusion, but Holmes was already reaching for his coat and hat. "Come, Watson," he said, his voice calm but charged with energy. "The game, as they say, is afoot, and this time, it seems, we chase shadows deeper than ever before." Without another word, he strode to the door, and I followed, the thrill of a new mystery already racing through my veins. Outside, the fog curled around us like a living thing, as though the city itself was hiding secrets yet to be unveiled. And thus, with the echoes of our last case still lingering, we stepped into the night, toward a fate neither of us could yet comprehend. Chapter 23. The Quiet Aftermath. The morning sun broke gently over Baker Street, casting soft beams through the windows of our sitting-room. The fire, now reduced to glowing embers, crackled faintly in the hearth. Holmes sat in his usual chair, long legs stretched out, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His sharp gaze, though fixed on a point beyond the window, seemed inward, lost in thought. E, seated opposite him, was writing up the final lines of my account, determined to record every element of the strange affair of the haunted carriage. before time dulled the details. For some moments neither of us spoke. The silence felt, for once, not uncomfortable but peaceful, like the air after a storm. Finally, I laid my pen down and looked up. "Holmes," I said quietly, "do you truly believe the case is fully closed? That all the threads have been tied?" He smiled faintly, though his eyes remained distant. "My dear Watson, few things in life are ever as neat as we would like them to be," he said, "but as far as human justice can reach, I believe this matter is settled." He leaned forward slightly, reaching for his pipe and lighting it with a careful hand. "And yet," I pressed, watching him, "there are still details that trouble me. The apparition, for one. Though we know the truth of the crime, what of the villagers? Tales. Surely they believed they saw something." A thin stream of smoke rose from Holmes's pipe as he considered this. "Ah, the mind, Watson. A curious instrument. It fills voids with spectres, especially when primed by fear and superstition." He glanced at me now, his eyes regaining some of their familiar sharpness. "But if our investigation has revealed anything, it is that even the most convincing ghost story often has a man or woman behind the curtain, pulling the strings." I nodded slowly, but a faint unease remained. "Holmes must have seen it, for," he added more gently, "still, I do not wholly dismiss the power of belief. Fear can shape reality for those who live too long in its shadow." The clock chimed the half-hour, its soft echo filling the room. After a pause, Holmes stood, walking over to the window. From there, he looked down onto the street below, where early carriages were beginning their rounds, and a newsboy's call drifted faintly to our ears. Without turning, he said, "You know, Watson, though the haunted carriage was but a mask for human cruelty, I cannot help but wonder." "Wonder what?" I prompted when he trailed off. "Whether there are mysteries that even I would not wish to solve," he murmured. "Things that lie beyond deduction and reason." It was rare to hear such words from Holmes, and for a moment I felt the chill of something larger than both of us, something vast and unknowable. Then, just as suddenly, Holmes turned back, his expression once again composed, almost amused. "But let us not drift into metaphysics, my friend. We have earned a rest, and I intend to enjoy it, until, of course, London sees fit to present us with another enigma." I smiled at that, closing my notebook with a quiet snap. "And yet," I mused, "sometimes I think the city itself is a mystery. Holmes, a great breathing riddle we shall never truly solve." Holmes chuckled softly, refilling his pipe. "Perhaps, Watson. But as long as men plot and passions flare, we shall have work enough." As I rose to pour a cup of tea, I found myself grateful for the quiet, for the moment. But in the corner of my mind, I could not forget the words of that midnight visitor, nor the strange message he had left in Holmes's hands. "The hourglass has been shattered." What new storm awaited us, I did not yet know, but sitting there, with Holmes's sharp eyes watching the dawn, I knew this. When the next mystery arrived, as surely it would, Sherlock Holmes and I would face it together, whatever shadows might come. The end.